Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 21st Sunday after Pentecost for the week of October 13th, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I'm excited to be back. As we kind of talked a little bit about last week, I had a couple weeks here where I was doing a little bit of traveling and doing a little bit of spending some time with family, which was awesome. It was great, but it's always good to get back in the booth and be able to talk with you guys, and it's exciting as we are getting nearer to the end of the church year, as we are approaching that. And there's definitely some difficult things that we get into right at the end, like Christ the King Sunday and things of that nature. But we still have a few weeks before we get there. And as we're in this fall season, at least where I'm at, we are definitely feeling the beginnings of fall and that movement, that change of seasons. And we've had that change within the church typically by this time of the year. You're having where things are starting to get into the routine again. Things are starting to flow again. And that's a process. It's a change. It takes a little bit of time for all that to sequence, for all that to start feeling right and feeling good again. But that's life, right? That's how this becomes habit, how we continue to go and grow. So let's get into the question that we had for last week, which was, where do you need to open up more? And where do you need to acknowledge more? And I think one of the things that we heard back from one of our loyal listeners is looking at the effects of what the hurricane has done and thinking about how can we be a light in that way. Is it providing monetary donations? Is it providing other types of donations? Is it reaching out to family? I think that's a great idea. I think one of the other things too is that continued awareness, being open, acknowledging where you're at, acknowledging the other people around you, acknowledging other things outside of humankind around you. I think that's a huge aspect of this. And I think that's part of where, as a people, as a world, especially as a people of faith, I feel that is something that we need to continue to work on and continue to grow in. It's one of those things that it constantly forces us to continue to stay open and allowing us to really acknowledge and see people who maybe aren't necessarily being recognized, kind of like what we talked a little bit about last week. So let's just jump into it. One of the alternative Old Testament texts that you can have this week is out of Job chapter 23, verses 1 to 9 and 16 and 17. So we're fast forwarding a lot here in the Job text, and this is where there has been some back and forth between some of Job's friends and Job at this point. And the friends are convinced that there's something that Job has done that has put the vastness of what Job has gone through. Job has lost basically everything at this point. And Job here in chapter 23 doesn't want to get to that point. Job is essentially stating that he recognizes that there is a God who is caring and loving and acknowledging the hardships of what is going on. And that not necessarily that Job has been abandoned or lost, but this is a moment where he continues to pursue and continues to have this fear, healthy fear of the Lord, like a healthy fear of a parent when you've messed up. This idea of how the actions of what is going on and trying to make sure that they are still pleasing to the Lord continues to drive Job in this section. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 22, the first 15 verses of it. And this is one of those texts that gets credited potentially coming from the cross, especially coming from the first verse. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From my words of my groaning. This idea of how things have been hard. Things are very difficult at this moment of the author, and the aspect of how God has continued to be there for their ancestors and has continued to help them through different situations, and that they cried and they were trusting in the Lord. So where is this now in this moment for them? That they are continuing to trust and call upon the Lord and recognize that in this is building that relationship. In that is the repeat and the aspect of how this is something that we have seen before. We know that God continues to work in these times, even when I'm feeling far away, that yet I still continue to work with you and pour out my heart to you. I think also kind of with where we'll go a little bit this week, I think verse 14 is really powerful as well. I am poured out like water and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. This idea of how they feel separated, they feel disjointed, they just feel unconnected to God. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is out of Amos chapter 5, verses 6 and 7 and 10 through 15. This is a text where the minor prophet of Amos is warning the tribe of Israel, and as they continue to kind of wrestle with continuing to follow God. But yet, here we have yet again how the author Amos is encouraging them to seek the Lord and look for them, and that if they continue to, at this point, kind of worship other gods and continue to disassociate, this is something that will continue to eat away at them, will continue to destroy them from the inside out, and that this is something that is not pleasant to the Lord. And in this case, there is a warning that there will be people coming from the north that will disrupt them, and which does happen here eventually. So this idea of how we continue to need to be seeking the Lord and continuing to, in difficult times, not necessarily be relying on our own strength. And if we do, in this case, the houses will be taken over, that there will be invaders, there will be other things, and we need to continue to trust in the Lord through difficult times, through times when we don't necessarily want to. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 90, verses 12 through 17. This is a text that then is recognizing that there is a lot of things within our lives that we don't necessarily have control of. That this is something that we need to recognize the blessings of what God is doing for us. So recognizing us to count our days, recognizing us to be able to be steadfast to what God is calling us to do and be gracious and give God the glory to what has happened day after day, recognizing that all of this is a blessing. And so thus, instead of us begrudgingly giving thanks to God when things are difficult, realizing that we are still giving praise to God emphatically when things are hard, recognizing that we have been blessed with another day. The New Testament text this week, the epistle text, is out of Hebrews chapter 4, verses 12 to 16. Again, based off of where we're going a little bit this week, verse 12 is really interesting here, and recognizing the power of God, and recognizing that He is sharper than any two-edged sword, and being able to separate the joints from the marrow, and being able to disassemble us, basically. But yet we still have to remember that we had a God who came and humbled himself as Jesus and was able to sympathize with us by putting on the weakness that our human bodies have, and being able to recognize that, feel that, respect that, being able to acknowledge that, and from that being able to actually give us life, being able to give a boldness of moving forward and a recognition of what is to come. The gospel text this week is out of Mark chapter 10, verses 17 to 31. This is an interesting text. It's one I would say it isn't necessarily in the top 10 most known, but I wouldn't say it's unfamiliar. And it's where we have a man who runs up to Jesus and initially says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus starts off by questioning, "Why are you saying I'm good? God alone is good." The man then starts listing off his credentials, listing off the things that he's done. I have done all these different things. And Jesus then, by verse 21, finally says, Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said, "You lack one thing. Go, sell everything that you own, and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." And this disheartens him, and this is shakes up the disciples a little bit, because again, just like our culture, there is definitely some elevation at times that we get with people of wealth. And Jesus then gets into this recognition of how hard it is at times for us with people of wealth, which again, if most of us listening to this, we have to recognize no matter where we feel we are on the socioeconomic scale, we are people of wealth. How hard it is for us to enter the kingdom of God, because at times we put our things ahead of ourselves. and recognizing that we are mortal, recognizing that these are all gifts from God, recognizing that the last will be first and the first will be last for many of us. This recognition on how we need to be able to treasure the gifts that we have been given and be willing to accept change, accept giving those away, accept allowing God to actually take control instead of us having all the control. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Whoa! Working Preacher, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, having some great commentary from some really great biblical scholars. So if you haven't checked that out and spent some time over there, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they've redone their website. There's really some cool resources over there, along with having devotions, liturgical colors, liturgical art. I feel like that is something that doesn't get talked about enough. And I think it's something that's really worth looking at and considering, because in that you're able to see how different people have interpreted it over time and can give you some new and unique ideas on how to look at these things. So along with the great resources over there, I'd highly recommend making sure that you check that out over at the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter. They're going through these same texts each week, along with giving some different ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to think about for your weekly preaching or weekly prepping for your weekly service each week, along with just some different ecological ideas and things. I'd highly recommend, if you're listening to this week after week for a half an hour each week, make sure to check them out. There's some great resources over there. I know myself, I have used them plenty of time. Jesus calls out the rich man. And like I kind of stated when we were summarizing this, we, as most of us listening to this, are the rich man. We are considered wealthy. We are considered giving of these great blessings. And yet we struggle with the idea at times of giving it all up. And I think this is also a moment that Jesus is really getting into something that I think is easily missed. When we look at a lot of these texts this week, it's all of transition. Job has had this huge transition of going from wealth to basic poverty, and this struggle of what is this all meaning? What is all going on? I think we also then have with Amos, the warning and people, you're going to lose things if you miss this. In Hebrews, the recognition that God has the power to do all these things, but yet recognizes our own limitations and is willing to take on that struggle so that God can better understand our own struggle. I think there are things in life that we struggle with, and I think there gets to be certain points in life we don't want to talk about them anymore. And I think this is the right week to talk about aging. So like I stated, I went and spent some time specifically with some of my wife's family and a couple relatives of my own. And the thing that you recognize, at least as I have, as I've continued to get older, is the passage of time. The time never loses, that things are changing and sometimes change quickly and sometimes change slowly. And that sometimes is a hard thing for us to grapple with. But there's other times that it's really easy for us to grapple with. So let's talk about it a little bit. Typically, when we think about aging, especially as adults, and we're talking about aging, we talk about things that are going on within our own body, things that are starting to change, things that are making things more difficult. So how we typically look at the body is that there is 9 different ways that our body starts to change internally that really start perpetuating the aging process. So one is altered intercellular communication. This is the lack of communication between cells being able to communicate. And a lot of this is due to, as our body is going through, and we'll talk a little bit about, there is more and more inflammation within the body, which thus makes it harder for these cells to communicate. We also then have the recognition of deregulated nutrient sensing, aka your cells being able to not sense as much when nutrients are around when they're needing them. Thus, it causes them to have trouble with repair and replication because they are preventing themselves from that until they have the nutrients to be able to be sustained. And in this, it can cause where the body starts to go into some weird things we'll get into here in a few moments. Another one that we run into is stem cell exhaustion. Stem cells go in and are a lot of the repairing mechanisms within our body, one of them, going through and trying to help a lot of these different cells. They have telomerase, which is an enzyme to extend our telomeres on the end of our chromosomes, which allow for aging to actually be a little bit prevented, and is repairing that process. One of the things that we have noticed is the telomeres at the end of our chromosomes, we have 23 pairs of them, most of us, and those pairs, as they duplicate, you lose a little bit. So us having a mechanism to help kind of repair helps extend the life then of this. But as we age, it becomes tired because it's working harder and harder, thus allowing some more of these errors to potentially happen, and the telomeres get shorter. And when the telomeres get shorter, we start also having some cellular senescence, which is where it becomes kind of nicknamed ghost cells, or there's no more replication, but the body hasn't necessarily gone through the atrophysis or controlled cell death. So these cells are kind of sitting there, and in that they create some of the inflammation, like we talked about earlier, which allows for the body to then be having some more issues, just generally trying to figure out how do we dispose of all of this stuff. We also then start having mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, remember that we have our own DNA and then we have mitochondrial DNA because, again, it is hypothesized that the mitochondria was its own organelle that got absorbed by our cells to be able to be the powerhouse of the cell. And just with how it's designed, there is a little bit more exposure to the DNA within the mitochondria, which allows for more chances for the DNA to be damaged. And this means that there's also a higher chance, with just how it is, to have more free radicals within the body, which is not good. It can cause additional damage. And in that, while all this is going on, remember the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It is what is providing the energy for your body. So as these things are going on, the powerhouse becomes less and less efficient. We also have the loss of prosthesis, which is the making of proteins, and that our proteins were folding wrong or they're bonding with the wrong proteins. And this can cause a huge cellular struggle because of this. We also talked about telomere attraction, where we're having the shorter telomeres and allowing for the separation to not be as easy, or making it so it's harder, making it that we're getting into actual genetic material potential. It makes it very difficult. And again, the controlled cell death. And are we getting into the senescence where suddenly we have these ghost cells sitting there? We also have epigenetics alterations. This is where within your genes, there's things that get turned on and turned off. And can you have where there's accidentally some genes that are getting turned on prematurely or not getting turned on to be able to heal things? There's an interesting video that I'll have down below where they were showing a study of two mice that were twins. They were in the same litter. And the difference in 10 months when they were able to inject some things to play around with the epigenetics, not going to affect their true genetics per se and how it's replicating, but just where it was putting splices so that the epigenetics kept having to heal and it was expressing things in weird ways. And the aging process was tremendous in 10 months for that mouse. Finally is genomic instability, where our body has to continually repair itself and in making it difficult for that. And we've heard what is all the different things. There's some of it that is beyond our control with genes, right? And some of it's just we need to make sure that we're eating a good diet and making sure that that isn't affecting us. We need to control and have good amounts of exercise. We need to also make sure that we're in a good environment. There's going to be environmental concerns where are you having air that's polluted? Are you getting exposed to UV rays, or harmful radiation. These types of things also affect how our body responds long term. Sleep is another one that I think as we continue looking at, we know that it affects things, but how much does it affect things long term? There's still some questions there, and there's some early research, as we've talked about in past episodes, of potentially some brain damage long term. We don't like talking about this stuff. We don't like talking about our bodies breaking down. We don't like talking about things changing. We don't like talking about that stuff. But yet, that's who we are. And it's who we've been designed to be. Another example of this is babies are born with more bones than the adult has. Babies are born with typically around 300 bones and also a lot of cartilage. And over their early stages of life, especially as they continue to grow, they will go through endodyal ossification, which is where these cartilage slowly becomes bones and the fusion of different bones. And why does that happen? The birthing process would be much more difficult if they were born with adult bones. But there was also a change in environment. There was no need for that child as they continue to grow to keep having that flexibility. They are able to grow and mature and be able to do these things. And yet we see that as normal and okay. It's as we get older, we suddenly struggle with that idea and concept a lot more. I know for me right now, one of the things I'm a little nervous about this week, I'm going to be running a race, and I know I brought it up 5 years ago, but I had like a pseudo-grandfather die on the 11th. And for various reasons, I'm with my family running a race, and part of what I'll be doing is thinking about him. This last week, I strained a calf, trying to heal other things that I was dealing with. And so there is a little bit of question at this moment as I'm recording, if I'm going to be able to achieve the goals and aspirations that I had for that. And mentally for myself, getting my head around the idea that I might not be able to do it exactly the way that I wanted to, and being okay with it. Also recognizing that there is a possibility, I'm still barely young on the scale of life, that I am noticing my body healing and I should be okay long term. But also recognizing my body is no longer a teenager's. There's more pain, there's more things that I'm dealing with, and there's more stretching and maintenance that I just need to generally do for my body to be able to be its best. Is that not a sacrifice? Is that not something that I need to do and give up? The recognition that there's going to come time where my body maybe isn't able to do everything that it used to do, and being okay with that. Recognizing that at that phase, I'm being called into something differently. Recognizing that struggle, that's not necessarily God abandoning me, but maybe God preparing me for something different, like Job. Recognizing that that's an opportunity for me to still recognize the gift and beauty of every single day, like we get in the Psalm, in Psalm 90, that we are given a blessing for another day. And yet my body overall is still functioning quite well. That yes, I have these irritants, but I still am blessed. Not to lose sight of it based off of what my body can't do, but recognize the blessings of what my body still can do. Recognize the transition. Not that the struggle becomes any less significant, but still that there is time and growth that still can happen. Recognizing for me as still a younger person, there's things that I need to be doing to make sure that I'm maintaining this and doing some preventative care for the long haul. But on top of it, also recognizing that this is appreciating my body for what it can do today as well. When we lose sight of this, kind of like what Amos is doing in chapter 5, when we lose sight of this, this is when we can lose so much. We have wealth, at least here in the United States, that 99% of us have, that parts of the world can dream about. And yet we say we don't have enough. And I realize that we struggle with that. We struggle with the idea of accumulation, always needing more. But sometimes in that, we lose sight of what we actually have. In spending time the last few weeks with family, I realize how amazing that time really is, because it's not guaranteed. In fact, a lot of the last 5 months for me has been spending time with family and trying to treasure that time, realizing that I'm not always going to be given that time, knowing that there's going to come a day where I'm going to long for that time. So then I must recognize the blessing of what it is today. Is there a mourning process with that? Sure. And we don't ever get the story of whether the rich man goes through this process or not. Because I think a lot of us would have some mourning in us losing things like that. And I think the Hebrews text helps us remember that Jesus did the same thing. But thus we have to still be willing and able to receive the call and to acknowledge the change and be willing to go through the change. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need to accept the change within your life? Where do you need to accept the change within your life? I don't think it's necessarily victimizing the rich man here. It's acknowledging that we all have to continue to change. We've changed from when we were a child to where we are now, and we're going to continue to change, and there's going to be a lot of it that's out of our control. There's things we can do to help it. There's things that we can do to do preventative care, but we all know at some point it's going to catch up with us. And we have to be willing to accept that as well. I think as I was kind of brainstorming this, it's kind of funny because we as humans are the ones, especially as adult humans, who don't like change. And yet we look at like where I'm at, the leaves on the trees are changing, and many of them are going to drop their leaves here in a matter of weeks, if not less than that. And acknowledging the change that is about to happen. We can't live in the moment of where we want to be forever. We have to be okay and accept that things change and things are going to continue to change. And we need to be willing and able to accept that call and adjust ourselves in that. Is that an easy task? By no means it is. But that's part of our calling. Part of that calling is acknowledging at times where we need to give up different parts of our wealth because we are being called into a new phase. It's hard. It's difficult. But in the person that we're trying to emulate, Jesus did that himself. So we have to continue to learn ourselves what that means. It's not easy. It's not necessarily fun. But I think there's also blessings within that. And we know from ourselves as we give wisdom, we give of our wealth, there's also enjoyment in that. And it gives us a glimpse of what the Heavenly Father did for us and what it must be like from the Father's perspective, giving us these gifts, even for a period of time. Let's recognize each day as a gift, recognize that we're not being abandoned, recognize that we might be going through a transition, and allow that transition to happen so that we can understand that there might be moments when we were first so that now we will be last. And there are moments now that we might be last, but God is going to still figure out a way that we will be first. This is a difficult lesson. This is a hard lesson. But if we accept the lesson and go with the lesson, I think the blessings out of the lesson are so much more than we ever can imagine. We learn to appreciate the life in which we have been given. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.